think this all starts with psychology, with in-group bias. Uh, Normally, in-group bias is just kind of like, we treat people in our groups better than other people, but it doesn't necessarily have to be out-group animosity. Out-group animosity starts picking up when you have perceived competition. Well, what is neoliberalism as a guiding principle in society? It's competition. So you have more and more people whose economic livelihoods are becoming more precarious. They're losing income relative to what they used to have 40 years ago, and they're certainly losing place compared to the wealthy in their societies. So you have this base of economic suffering. This is my understanding theory of what's going on. You have this base of economic suffering, and then you have then fertile soil for explanations that explain to people why they are suffering. So if you turn on the radio in the US, I don't know how it is in Europe, but I would imagine it's relatively similar. There are plenty of easily accessible media outlets where you're just driving to work, listening to the radio, you turn on the TV, easily accessible messages that explain your suffering as the result of these immigrants coming and taking your job, and the government is spending so much on these other ethnic groups, not your group, and that's why you're suffering.
Welcome to another episode of Bad Beat Media. Good to see you again, Peter.
Good to see you, Kareem.
Yes. So, lots of things have happened these days, and I thought I'll just have a chat with you about all the things that we've seen, and I've noticed like this you could almost say a red line. Going through all the topics I would like to discuss with you today, starting with Dr. Cornel West's refusal, or actually, what was it? His resignation letter. He has written to Harvard.
Right.
Right.
Apparently he had been recommended for tenure by the relevant committee or his department, and then the administration rejected it.
Right. And he talks about the spiritual rot of higher education, of in particular Harvard, but also of the neoliberal universities, institutions you see in the West. And he talks about this spiritual rot that you see. Let me first quickly share the screen so people can see it. So here you can see it. Cornel West accuses Harvard of spiritual rot in resignation letter. And I think we can extrapolate this to the West in general. What we will talk about today is that we have this really decaying spiritual rot of society, I would say, which is very evident in first of all, in our institutions, and in particular, in this case, in our universities. And Cornel West, he writes a one-page letter about the fact that there is an intellectual and spiritual bankruptcy in Western education, and that that it has been a steady decline and decay in our part of the world. And as you can see here as well, he also really blasts the market drivenness of our universities, the neoliberalization, the privatization, you could almost say, of our universities.
And I think that's a key linkage to point out, that it's the market-driven nature of the universities very much linked to the spiritual rot. It reminds me of this really creepy thing that Margaret Thatcher said. That she said something like, "Economics is the method," or she said, I think she misspoke. She said, "Economics are the method, but the purpose is to change souls."
Right.
So, that, I think that's been quite successful, that project. The neoliberal project, I think, has done a lot to change souls by making us more competitive, thinking of ourselves more as individual competitors in a kind of rough and tumble jungle out there, whether it's in the private sector and business, whether it's in universities, it's the same ethic of individual competition. And then, yeah, so I think that that's very much linked.
Yeah, exactly. Very good what you say there. And it's amazing how prophetic Margaret Thatcher was with regards to neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And indeed, this market-driven rot you see in Western universities is actually very, how you can, symptomatic, is a symptom you see actually in every aspect of Western society, what we will talk about today. For example, dealing with coronavirus, the way racism is still going on in our societies, imperialism, for example, US imperialism towards Cuba. So all these things pretty much come down to one thing, I think, and that is right what you see here, this market-driven capitalist rot of our societies that really decay everything on every level: education, race / ethnicity relationships, dealing with disasters like coronavirus, and on and on and on and on. And you see it with Dr. Cornel West, and he says it himself, is that when universities are privatized, education, the way our intellectual development is privatized, and big donors, huge, powerful donors are putting money in these universities, what happens is of course, these universities will not study or express views that go against these big, powerful donors, because they will lose their money. Okay, this is this market-driven system. And who are big, powerful donors to Harvard University? Of course, many times pro-imperialist, pro-Israel, kind of very wealthy Americans. And what you see then is when you have somebody like Cornel West, who is not only a Black academic, and that already is a marginalized position in the United States, but also a very, very strong supporter of marginalized communities like the Palestinians. When you go for tenure as one of the most leading academics and public intellectuals, you get refused. Your tenure gets refused, which is just such a blatant example of the sickness of our system. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes from top to bottom. So you were talking about the top of universities, but even at the bottom, I just looked up the data on tenure, and in 2018, the Chronicle of Higher Education reported that somewhere in the 20% range of faculty at universities in the U.S. today are tenured, and only 10% are on a tenure track. So basically what that means is you've seen this change in universities throughout the United States and in other parts of the world, away from these institutions where scholars could go, they would be on a tenured track. So basically they would do their research work, they would do their teaching, but then after 4, 5, 6 years, they would have a permanent job. So they would have job security, something that's incredibly rare in our neoliberal economic system around the world today. But the key thing about that job security was it gave you the freedom to pursue whatever research that you wanted to. Without that, and this is just at the bottom, then you have to be very concerned about all sorts of other worries, like is my research going to be perceived as too controversial? Is it going to anger people and make me even less likely to ever get job security? So even at the very bottom of the university structure, you have this kind of spiritual rot or market driven kind of corruption, corrupting the purpose of a university as a place for the free pursuit of knowledge. And then, yeah, as you said, at the very top, then you have influence from major donors. So you have, I think what's happening to Cornel West here is not too dissimilar to what happened to MLK Jr. when, he was only talking about the plight of Afro-Americans.
MLK, just for the audience, you mean Martin Luther King?
Yeah, Martin Luther King Jr., yeah. When he was only talking about the plight of African-Americans, the racism that they faced in the Jim Crow South, he had a lot of support among the white liberal establishment of the United States. But then when he started talking about Vietnam, when he started saying that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, when he started talking about economic issues, making his message more cross race, class based, that's when he started to lose the support of the white liberal establishment. And people don't realize that he was quite unpopular actually a few years before he was assassinated, because he touched on these issues that were where there was a massive disagreement among the more powerful elements of society. And here you have the same thing. I'm sure if Cornel West spoke only about racism itself and didn't touch on any sort of geopolitical issue like U.S. support for Israel versus the Palestinians, I'm sure he would be tenured today.
Yeah, and not just that. I think if he only speaks about the watered down kind of racism, where we talk about bad words and that kind of stuff, but never about systemic racism, structural racism that is deeply embedded in our institutions and that can only be undone, for example, by huge reparations. We're going into the trillions, so to speak, to really cross that wealth gap of hundreds of years of slavery versus colonial domination, So I totally agree with you. So again, if what happens with this spiritual rot of market-driven universities is that, of course, you have to listen to what the elite wants to hear, what elites want to hear. You see the same with mainstream media, which are run by market-driven forces. And of course, what happens is mainstream media starts to talk in a way that is not offending big money, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that brings me also to this idea that still is in the heads of many of the Asian students. Okay, which frustrates me. As a professor here in Hong Kong, and you as well, who teach at one of the world's leading institutions. I mean, we cannot deny that. Yet we still have this idea here in Hong Kong, for example, but many parts of Asia, that to get a good education, you have to go to one of these propaganda machines in the West, where you have to be, well, not too much against imperialism, where international relations is purely a Western Eurocentric discussion about state relations and inter-country competition and all that watered down stuff, without ever really focusing on more critical reflection of that very propagandistic social science.
Yeah, and they just basically assume that like interstate relations in Europe for the past 500 years describe human nature. They basically make
exactly
that. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that is a big problem. The fact that a lot of people around the world, and in particular here in Asia, still think they have to go to Harvard or Cambridge to get a good education. While that may have been the case during the old days when the West was the center of the world, a colonial superpower. And I say the West very broadly, of course. We were talking mainly about the UK and the United States afterwards. And that it's still that myth that is in a lot of people's minds. What do you think? What would you say to Asian students when they say like, oh, I want to do my PhD at Harvard and while they have the chance to do it here at a great Chinese university, for example, as well. What do you think when you hear that?
Well, I think it's a matter of, our brains are limited. We can't possibly absorb all the knowledge in existence. So when it comes to judging universities, it's really easy just to go by brand names. The brand name of Harvard or Yale or Cambridge or whatever, that has spread very widely and it's associated with quality. And if you don't know much about the university structure overall in the world, then you can kind of be forgiven for just going with the easy thing. Like, what do you want to drink? I'll drink a Coke rather than a cola that you don't know. I think it's really at that level of sophistication. But when somebody asks me, where should I go to study? I say, well, I can't answer that question until I know what you plan to study. Because there is no one university that is superior in every single field. You really have to look at the area you're interested in studying. Then you have to look at who's teaching, who's done the work that you think is the best. Because there are, plenty of debates to be had over what approach to any given field is the best. And it never correlates perfectly with the sort of brand name recognition of a university. You know, if a student said that they want to go study economics, I would say, you know, one of the last places I would recommend would be Harvard. You know, I
Exactly.
would, you know, University of Missouri, Kansas City would be my first recommendation. Then Stony Brook. It all varies by topic, but you know, people go by brand names.
Yeah, and not just that. I think it's also a remnant of of our colonial past, of course, where we were all indoctrinated with this idea that the West was the center of the world and the center of humanity, and we didn't need to go anywhere or look to any other place in the world if you wanted to develop yourself as a human being. You had to be in Europe or you had to be in the United States, even though we slowly crawling out of that that how can I say that almost that trance, you know,
Yeah.
by opening up to the history of the rest of mankind, and we realized that pretty much all over the world you had this fascinating intellectual history of human progress, creativity, and intellectualism, and so forth. So I yeah, I really think that what happened here with Harvard and Dr. Cornel West is an important, I think, and a pivotal moment in Western hegemony with regards to education, because it's you see it now on so many levels. It's like we are really living, all of us, we're living the decay of the West, so to speak. And this is one of the crucial examples, you know, one of the biggest pillars of Western expression of greatness and excellence was, of course, its educational institutions such as Harvard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that brings me actually to the next thing I wanted to share and talk about with regards to the spiritual rot of the West, which is very much related. Even though some people may not see the connection, there is a huge connection, and it's very important to talk about. And that is, of course, the way the West is dealing right now with coronavirus. Okay, and I found a very interesting article. It's actually in the German newspaper, let me see, Der Tagesspiegel, which is a well-known German paper, where they actually talk about the West's failure to deal with coronavirus as a form of, let me see, they had a very nice, let me see, term for it. And it's called, what did they say again? Post-colonial arrogance. So which means like post-colonial arrogance or colonial ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the few Western or at least European papers where I actually saw this discussed. I've written myself an article about it. Hopefully it will be published soon. About, it's amazing. So this morning I got a WhatsApp message from my friend in the Netherlands, okay, my country. And he literally said, hey, by the way, how are things actually with regards to coronavirus in China and Hong Kong? Because we never hear about that. And I was like,
yeah,
you must be joking. We're talking about the country that has pretty much erased coronavirus. I've actually checked the graphs of all the infections, and pretty much Hong Kong since May has almost no cases anymore. It's pretty much done. And China, similar story. And in the Netherlands right now, we're talking about today, July 17, while the cases were finally going down after almost, let's say, from September 2020 until June 2021, we had cases in the tens of thousands every day, new cases. And it finally went down last month. I kid you not, It completely shut up this month, July, to the maximum peak we had before, approximately the same, in the tens of thousands of cases
Per day.
per day. We're talking about a country with 15 million people, or 17 million. And in the UK, they have 50,000 now per day. And they are not talking about Asia unless it's about talking about how Asians are doing better because they're more collectivist, they have authoritarian governments, they have a more of a hive mindset. And it's very great what they say in this article. It's the typical Western colonial view of the world, where only the self is relevant. You don't need to look outside to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And if you look outside to the rest of the world, you do it with the colonial gaze, very stereotypical of other human beings, and actually very unworthy, if not totally unworthy, to learn from.
Oh yeah. I mean, I see that. It's almost heartening to see that in Europe because I'm so familiar with that in the US, where it's not even like a form of colonial ignorance because it applies even to learning anything from Europe. Like when you see healthcare debates in the US, it's very rare that they would look out to any other country in the world to see
Right.
what other people are doing. So it's even worse than this, but I think this is more relevant right now because yeah, it's really striking to see how successful the government responses have been generally in this region, East Asia, Vietnam, China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, Korea, etc. You know, the fact that that experience isn't very much discussed at all in the West, which has had, broadly speaking, an absolute failure of a response. It's pretty striking to see that just complete blind spot.
Yeah, and what would you describe as the reason for this blind spot? I would just say it's pure colonialism,
Yeah, yeah,
racial
basically.
colonialism.
Those people are other. There's really nothing to learn from them. We know everything that is essential, and yeah, I mean, we can buy their products, but we're certainly not going to learn any lessons to apply in terms of policy.
Exactly. So here I'm going to show you an interesting example. So can you see it?
Yeah.
So
The y-axis here is, are they the same? No, no, they're quite different. Never mind. The y-axis here is very different.
very different.
Yeah.
So let me tell you this: the Netherlands has approximately double the amount of people compared to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is maybe 1/7 in size of the Netherlands, because of it's such a high dense place, which makes it even more difficult with infections.
Yeah.
Maybe some coordination is easier, of course, but we are talking about an international hub where everybody comes and goes in Asia. So as you can see here, the Hong Kong had 3 or maybe 4 peaks, okay, and all these peaks were solved within approximately 3 months. Okay, 3 months, you can say these peaks were pretty much solved around 3 months. Total amount of coronavirus cases in Hong Kong was 11,900, let's say 12,000. Let's go to the Netherlands. Okay, double amount of people, so it's not too crazily different.
Oh, it's only double the total
Yeah,
population.
Netherlands has approximately 16 million, 17 million people. Hong Kong has approximately 8 million people.
Yeah.
You see it shooting up in September 2020, and like they just cannot solve it until we have the vaccines. We solve it until June 23, last month. Then the Delta variant comes in because we're opening everything up. We're not doing quarantines. We're not doing anything because neoliberal privatized industries need to make money. And what happens? We're back at square one.
Yeah, and I think
in a couple of days, within 10, 20 days.
Yeah, I think you're right to tie it to economic ideology because I think that's a major, that's an additional factor preventing Western countries from really learning anything from Asian countries. is, so there is I think the colonial ignorance, just oh, those are the other, we don't need to learn anything from those people. But you also have the economic ideology, which is the economic production is supposed to be done through this free market system that just on its own, if left alone, will evolve into this beautiful equilibrium where all resources are used with perfect efficiency, and production is maximized, and people's happiness or utility is maximized, blah, blah, blah. It's really just an article of faith. It's just a belief. And so but it's such a strong, deeply ingrained belief that when it comes to a problem like this pandemic, where the effective solutions really do require a significant degree of government action and coordination, in Western countries that are completely captured by this faith, this ideology, this economic ideology, the required response is simply off the table. That's far too much government intervention. You're messing this perfect equilibrium. There's no idea, even recognition, even that government in the past, even in Western countries' own past, the pasts of Western countries themselves, they've used government intervention extremely effectively in the past. But that sort of lesson has been forgotten, and this faith in the unparalleled wonders of a free market system has replaced it entirely, so that a response to a pandemic is just woefully inadequate.
Yeah, no, very, very good what you say there. And it's just amazing if you compare these numbers. So Hong Kong has an amount of coronavirus cases, total cases, as much as the Netherlands has per day. And not only that, the amount of deaths in Hong Kong is 212. And in the Netherlands, one of the first world richest countries in the world, has almost 18,000 deaths. And in total, almost 2 million cases. This is just such a blatant example of how bad our system works. And again, we're talking about Dr. Connes's words, the spiritual rot of our societies. And I think you make a good point there in saying you focus very much on the psychological part, that we believe in this market-driven system in the West, that personal responsibility, individualism, we don't need to work together or each other, we all need to save ourselves. That's the way the world works. We compete, and same with companies, they all compete. You don't have a centralized control over our economic area in society. But that is the psychological part, and that is more of the, I would say, the way capitalist propaganda worked, to get the people to believe in something that maybe a lot of capitalists deep inside did not believe in, but they knew it would make them more money. So what I'm trying to say is that this belief in the market, that the market would like even things out and make a very successful, create a very successful society. If you're a capitalist and you try to get people believe in this, you know it makes you money. You know it will make you rich. So I think that deep inside, many capitalists knew this was nonsense, because if it makes them richer and richer and richer, it means that you don't have equal competition all the time. Because if you have equal competition all the time, then it means you cannot get monopolies. It means you cannot grow your wealth increasingly huge. So I think it has been one of the most successful ways in the West, at least, to propagandize the world, or at least the West and large chunks of the world, to make them believe that the thing that makes capitalists very rich, the so-called free market, is something they deep inside know is not the way the world works, but it just makes them richer. You understand what I mean?
I do. I think I wouldn't go so far in attributing intelligence to our business leaders, our capitalists.
Not intelligence. I think it's more nefarious.
Yeah, to be nefarious requires a certain degree of intelligence that I'm not sure that they have, in the sense that
Milton Friedman.
My belief, though, is that they're true believers in this. Like, there's a funny meme that's like a mother and her child, and the child says, "When I grow up, I want to be a libertarian," and the mom says, "You have to pick one. You can't do both." And it's funny because it is attaching to something real. You'll meet a lot of people in the US when they're young who are libertarians, but you kind of grow out of that because it's just such an absurd ideology. Like as you develop and learn more and read more, you just realize it's entirely untenable. But I think a lot of people in business who devote their lives to making more money, I think their knowledge really does stop at university. So they'll take their Econ 101 class, maybe a few other economics classes. They'll learn, traditional neoclassical economics. They'll be inculcated with this belief that free markets, according to these sets of equations, are the most perfectly efficient as long as you make these assumptions. But let's forget about that. And so they end up with this belief system that I think sticks with them for the rest of their life. And I'm not even sure they recognize the disconnect between that ideology, their economic ideology, and their business practices, which seek to avoid competition. Because even according to neoclassical economics, if you have perfect competition, profits are squeezed to next to nothing. So they don't want that, and certainly
Exactly.
they want their lobbyists to work to get as many benefits as possible from the government. But I'm not sure they even realize the inconsistency there between their actions and their ideology. But that's just because it's just an assumption on my part, or a belief on my part, that I don't see a lot of intellectual rigor among our kind of capitalist class, broadly speaking.
Yeah, and I think this is also a huge part why with coronavirus things are going so, yeah, are so terrible in Europe and in the United States. And that is, if you have a very privatized market driven economy, there is no way as a government you can actually coordinate things, because all these companies you so-called need to control and coordinate have been all cut up, privatized, and they had to compete with each other.
Yeah.
So everybody who's competing with each other for the biggest piece of the pie, how can you coordinate them to work together? You can't. Yeah. So you have a completely, how do you say that? A government that is unable to make any decisions. Okay, that is completely, how do you call that?
Well, in the Marines, they call it a clusterfuck. But
okay.
that's Marine Corps terminology.
No, I'm looking for the word like when you can't move anymore, like a handicapped person.
Yeah, well, they're immobilized. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're completely immobilized. They have no power because they have given all that power to these private corporations. So what happens as a result? Our governments fall back on the thing that was the psychology that was so important for the system: personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. So because you cannot control your society as a government, you say, yeah, but wait a minute. That's what happens in the Netherlands. Seriously, we have our government saying that the cases are rising because of you guys.
Right? Yeah.
It's your responsibility.
I was so surprised to see this, like my friends in the US, like talking about this as like a personal morality issue. Like, are you being a good person and staying indoors? Are you being a bad person and going outside without a mask? I'm like, this is the most ass backwards way of thinking of it. Your individual personal choice is meaningless. The only thing that matters is how the entire society in an organized, coordinated fashion acts. And if the government's not doing that, and you're just putting it on the moral shoulders of individuals and of society, that's just a guaranteed failure.
Exactly. And so you get that whole neoliberal personal responsibility thing. And it's you guys who don't wear masks, and it's you guys who do this, and it's you guys who do that. But at the same time, our government throws everything open because they cannot control the society. They cannot close things down. The companies don't want that. And then you have cases rising up. And then I wonder, okay, you say personal responsibility. Then please tell me, why do we have a government? Why does a government exist if we all need to, when we have a disaster?
Well, the government exists to be like a school marm that wags its finger at bad people, bad individuals who are doing the bad things. That's apparently
right.
the role.
Instead of a government trying to solve problems, for the good of the people in a society.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
And this whole personal responsibility actually takes away all the need and necessity for a government to deal with large-scale systemic societal problems such as a disaster, but not just as a disaster. Also, when it comes down to, for example, something like racism, okay, like football racism, what we saw in the UK. I don't know if you've seen that in the UK. And let's talk about that spiritual rot again on another level. So there is this very interesting article. Let me share it with you.
As you're bringing that up, just to finish that last point about the
Go ahead.
Spiritual rot in the in economic ideology and how that affects policy. There was an article just a couple of days ago in the MIT Technology Review talking about the new big problem for the solar industry. And what is that problem? During the day, it produces too much electricity, and so that lowers prices. And so then that takes away the incentive to invest in enough solar panels that we need to provide our electricity in place of fossil fuel provision of electricity. So the hilarious thing is, because it's too cheap and too efficient, the market is not going to provide it because you can't get enough return on your investment. So this is just a perfect example of how insane the system is. And
Yeah.
I want to give like some credit to people who are in favor of markets. Like, there are definite benefits to decentralization in economic planning and production. Like, it does do some things extremely efficiently and produce consumer goods in
Right.
abundance in the countries that have access to the resources at cheap prices, which is,
Yeah.
and of course, a matter of imperialism. But you know, when we're dealing with a problem like this, either the pandemic, climate change, these are problems that cry out for coordinated government solutions. The market is just not the right institution to solve these kinds of problems. But to people who only know economic organization through marketplace interactions, a decentralized form of planning, to people who only know that and believe that that's the only way you can do anything economically, well, you see the results that we have today.
Yeah, as well, it's very simple. I always say that once you allow the market to how can I say it, to infiltrate, that's a good word. The moment you let the market infiltrate the world of human necessities, things that are necessary for our survival,
Yeah,
things go wrong. Whether it's disasters where you need coordinated influence of a government, whether it is healthcare, if you need profit, you know, as a market-driven company, what do? You crank up your medicine prices. It would be good to have chronically diseased people because they keep paying for your pills. Health, a healthy society is not good because, hey, you're not making money anymore. And I can go on. Let's talk about other things like the weapons industry. The profit motive in the weapons industry. Hey, we need war because more war gives me more money because I am for example, somebody is a weapons manufacturer like Raytheon. You want war because they buy all these, they buy these huge millions of dollars per bomb weapons. And it keeps going and keeps going, and the money is being raked in and in and in. So the profit motive in human essentials, water, healthcare, food, or disaster or human suffering, war, disease, pandemics, you see that the market economy is a disaster, is going to bring us to self-destruction. You know, that's why we have climate change. But when it comes to non-essential products, let's say an iPhone or t-shirts or whatever, it works very well. You know, there's no threat to our survival in that sense. People are willing to pay if they have the money. And of course, I'm not talking about all the minerals that are needed for things like iPhone. So let's forget about that for a moment. But I mean more like non-essential consumer goods. Then the market, I would say, is not that threatening. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So To extrapolate this rot, this societal rot, to another aspect is this very important thing that just happened. The England team was almost European champion in football, and the Italians won the championship. But for the first time in many decades, the English were in the finals, which is a very good accomplishment. And what happened was that these English football players did a very non-threatening, peaceful, anti-racism protest by just sitting on their knee during the anthem, national anthem.
Yeah, I was surprised to see the Italian team did that as well.
Right, and I think that is very good way of putting some attention on the extreme racism that we still have in Europe, but also in the West in general and the world, which is a remnant of colonialism. And what happened is a complete outpouring of racism again, which shows how relevant actually their protest is. And they're showing monkey emojis and saying the N-word, and that is another aspect of our societies that we just don't seem to be able to solve. And one thing why we are not solving it is also related to what we just said, is that our governments are hands off. So what happened was, before these English players were in the finals, every time they were taking the knee, the audience was booing, okay? And this was, of course, very insulting to the players, and regularly politicians were asked, what do you think about this? Even the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, what do you think about this? You know, that people are booing the players when they are taking the knee against racism. And politicians would just say, like, everybody has the right to boo. You know, this is okay. So in other words, it's okay to boo your own people who are fighting against racism. Hands off. And then after they lost the finals, the racism became so extreme and so bad that it's the same politicians who say, oh, how can you do that? How can you show that kind of racism? This is disgusting racism, even though they were semi-supporting it themselves. And in both cases, we have this hands-off personal responsibility. How can you be so racist, they say.
Time to wag your finger.
Time to wag the finger. Your responsibility. How can you be so racist? Without ever questioning where it comes from. Because there is no systemic effort from our governments, from our societies, to go against these hundreds of years of racialized thinking. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Well, again, you could tie it to the economic ideology. Like if basically any sort of fundamental transformation of the economic system is impossible, like if that's what you believe, like that's not even on the table, then what are you left with? Finger wagging, moral hectoring. That's basically all you've got. But if you really wanted to change the social structure of UK, US to reduce or even eliminate racial disparities, that requires fundamental economic transformation. And that implies that also would require a relative reduction in the status and wealth, relatively speaking, of the most wealthy, most powerful people in those societies. So that's just considered completely off the table. It's not even really discussed very much at all. And so when you do that, then yeah, what are you left with? What is your solution to systemic racism? It seems like it's corporate racial sensitivity trainings that don't work. The evidence shows they don't work. So that's basically all you're left with. And then why should it be a surprise at all that this problem doesn't go away?
Right, then you get that personal responsibility again. So you have structural racism, but what happens is, what can we do about racism? You get bias training, anti-bias training. So you try to change an individual's mind with anti-bias training. You put that individual after anti-bias training again into the world where you have darker skinned people and non-Western people being marginalized. And what happens? It completely nullifies the bias training and you start to get your old cognitions again. You know, I mean, we are a product of our environment. You can train it all you want. If our environment keeps imprinting us with racialized thinking, it maintains. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is, I think this tweet is very interesting. Keir Starmer is Labour Party's leader in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And you always get this from these politicians. Anyone racially abusing them is a disgrace and doesn't represent us at all. And I like this reaction from this British guy, but it does represent us. And every time someone pretends it doesn't, we have a problem. Yeah, let's just start admitting it. It does represent us. It's a deep factor that is embedded in our neo-colonial, racialized capitalist system, where we have built 500 years of wealth, and we've maintained that wealth in a totally nonsense category called white people. Okay, we just lumped people from Europe together who relatively look a bit the same and say, okay, we classify those as white. We lumped all the wealth over 500 years of colonial domination among these people. And these people are now the richest, and they control our society. And of course, they maintain that system because otherwise they have to share that wealth with other categories, such as Black or Asian, or as long as we think in these categories, people don't want to share with these other categories, because categories, we are very tribal as human beings, categories create competition. So as long as we think in racial categories, we are not gonna equalize wealth and power. And it's just hypocritical of these politicians. I mean, we have the exact same politicians in the Netherlands, also for Labour. They are exactly the same. They are neoliberal, capitalist. They say racism doesn't represent us, but they will never, ever structurally change anything, because it would mean it changes hierarchies, you know?
Yeah. And also like just the, again, going back to that economic ideology, if you really do believe, you really do have faith that a free market system produces the best possible outcomes, and there's only, you know, sticky little factors that sometimes impinge upon the perfect operation of the system, but government's job is just to kind of remove those little impediments here and there, but otherwise keep hands off. Well, then if you see a problem like racial disparities, and what are you supposed to do? I mean, the market is supposed to just eliminate that, because racism is inefficient. You have papers in economics showing that you know, firms that would use racist hiring practices would be worse off in competition because they wouldn't get the best people. So the system's supposed to kind of just work all that stuff out. If you really believe that, you know, it's hard to see how you really make any sort of fundamental intervention in the society to change anything. You know, it's an ideology of tying your hands, basically.
Yeah, and it's an ideology that actually just ignores human nature. Because if it thinks that just the market will solve the issue of racism, because if it's more profitable to incorporate other people into your company or whatever, then of course that would happen. But the funny thing is, we human beings are not market driven, how can I say that, creatures. We are actually very subjective, often ideological, and of course, here we go again, tribalist creatures. So even if it would make you more money, let's give an example. For a lot of working class white people, it will make them a lot of more money if they vote for socialists. But if these socialists are often Black people, or these socialists say we need to do something about racism, a lot of white people will still vote for right-wing capitalists that make them poorer. Why? Because they focus on skin color, on the category of race and skin color, where you see that this whole idea of a neutral market-driven kind of tendency, oh, it makes more sense. I make more money if I align myself with Black people, or I align myself with Asians, or whatever. It seems not, it doesn't work that way, because human beings are very subjective beings that get triggered by a multitude of motivations, depending on their own experience, depending on the way they were brought up, depending on their character, and of course our tribalism. Why do so many white people and women vote for Donald Trump while he says the most despicable things about women, when he says the most despicable thing about well, even their own group of people, that poverty is your own fault and you need to work hard and whatever. And I don't know if Trump said that, but let's say Republicans often say that about their own base, like, yeah, just work harder, stop being a welfare queen and that kind of stuff. Why would they vote for them and not for, and they are scared of socialist black people or whatever, Marxist BLM and that kind of stuff? While at the same time, it would just make more sense to associate yourself with Marxists and BLM for your own good than with a oligarchy, with a kleptocratic capitalist elite that says, vote for us because we are white people, so to speak. Vote for us because we are not giving money to these foreigners or these what I'm just trying to say before I become too how can I say it, chaotic, is that people often choose something else over their wallet. You know what I mean? After ideology, category, tribalism over their wallet, right?
Yeah. We actually know from political science research that people are sociotropic voters. They're not typically, most people are not pocketbook voters that only vote in their perceived economic interest. They vote for what they perceive to be beneficial for the society at large or their group at large. But I think this all starts with psychology, with in-group bias. Normally, in-group bias is just kind of like, we treat people in our groups better than other people, but it doesn't necessarily have to be out-group animosity. Out-group animosity starts picking up when you have perceived competition. Well, what is neoliberalism as a guiding principle in society? It's competition. So you have more and more people whose economic livelihoods are becoming more precarious. They're losing income relative to what they used to have 40 years ago, and they're certainly losing place compared to the wealthy in their societies. So you have this base of economic suffering. This is my understanding and theory of what's going on. You have this base of economic suffering, and then you have fertile soil for explanations that explain to people why they are suffering. So if you turn on the radio in the US, I don't know how it is in Europe, but I would imagine it's relatively similar. There are plenty of easily accessible media outlets where you're just driving to work, listening to the radio, you turn on the TV, easily accessible messages that explain your suffering as the result of these immigrants coming and taking your job, and the government is spending so much on these other ethnic groups, not your group, and that's why you're suffering. The other explanation is just much harder to get. Like, you could find it if you go to the library and just start reading lots of books. Sure, absolutely. It's not like it's impossible to get, but it's much, much harder. So you just know, as a matter of like epidemiological principle, like if you have a certain disease that spreads at a certain rate, a low rate, and there's only a few people with that disease, you just know that disease is not going to spread very much. Well, you can think of ideas in the same way. If they're not widely accessible, easily accessible, they're not going to be picked up. So what is available? The explanation, the right-wing explanation that it's these others, these other groups that are in competition with you, and they're taking resources unfairly. That's why you're suffering. The other explanation, the more left-wing explanation of it's an economic system that is not working for us, it's working for only a very small percentage of the population, that's just a much harder explanation to encounter kind of accidentally. You're not going to be exposed to that explanation as you drive to work and flip through the radio dial. You're not going to be exposed to that explanation if you just come home after a long day of work and turn on TV news and try to find out what's going on in the world. But you do get the right-wing explanation that blames the immigrants, the ethnic others. That you can find. So I think that's really what's going on here fundamentally.
Right, and I also think that is what the capitalist class really has discovered, is by dividing people into categories and make them compete. That is what neoliberalism did, neoliberal capitalism. Divide them into categories. I don't care what kind of categories, trans versus non-trans versus left versus right versus Christian versus this versus that, black, white, yellow, doesn't matter, all these ridiculous categories, put people into categories, and then start to make them compete based on these categories. So you see that the capitalist class, often elections are not about people's real lives. Elections often revolve around how one category, let's say the left, is talking about trans people in a way that is very bad according to the right, who have a very different, who are supposed to have a different view on trans people, and make them compete over that. In the old days, you had it with abortion, Christian values, all that stuff. Make them compete over that, and then they forget. Here we have the tribalism again. People forget about the real problems in their lives, and think about economic woes, think about healthcare, think about infrastructure, think about imperialism. Forget about that. We're going to fight the whole day, every day, over gay rights, Christian values, trans people. And it's just, that shows the kind of sheep mentality of human beings. They forget about their biggest problems and even revolve every 4 years of voting on these issues. You know what I mean?
I mean, even you said the kind of capitalist class, even the feudal plantation owner class had this figure.
But these were capitalists.
Yeah, true. I mean, you can look at it different ways, but like still in the 1800s, you had the kind of ruling class of the US South with basically that same idea. The whole concept of white privilege kind of comes from this realization that if you tell, so you have poor blacks and whites, the blacks are enslaved, the whites are just, in similar conditions of poverty, most of the population. Then you have the ruling class that owns the plantations and lives a life of leisure, etc. But then you say, but this system is actually pretty good because you're white and you're superior. So don't, why upset the system? You've got something. You've got something that makes you very valuable. Your white skin. Of course, we're going to grind you into the dirt and exploit the hell out of you, and your life is going to be miserable. But you're really special because you don't have melanin in your skin. So don't think about organizing with or considering a kind of similar class interest. And so you had this kind of de facto propaganda operating in the U.S. for hundreds of years now.
Yeah, right. And that was so successful. Don't mingle with these other people because you're better than them. And then you would have no class cooperation to revolt against the oppression, against the capitalist class. But the problem always with these things is, and that brings us back to Thatcher and the whole psychological part, is that eventually it becomes part of culture and it gets into the psyche of people, where it's not just a tactic of the elites, but like you said as well, where people start to believe in it as an objective reality. You know what I mean? Like what may be a tactic for some very nefarious elites by dividing people and making them not class collaborate, becomes so normal that it becomes culture. You know what I mean? Whereas white supremacism, for example, becomes part of academia, part of just the way people perceive each other in the world. And it's the same with capitalism. Even though some capitalists maybe knew that if you compete with each other and if you let people compete categorically in so-called free market, which would make them more rich, eventually it becomes ingrained in culture, where people really see themselves as individualized and disconnected from other people. And people feel that life is competition, not collaboration. That we don't have another conception of the world anymore. People will often would say, like in the West, when I grew up, like, yeah, this is life. We human beings are naturally competitive. That is life. Life is like nature. It's eat or get eaten. Mm-hmm. But this is not human nature. This is not natural. This is just dependent on what kind of world you have been born into. If we go to the Amazon, you have very collaborative groups where competition is very, very minor aspect of their human life.
It's so frustrating to hear that kind of ignorant argument, because on the one hand, yeah, of course, competition is part of human nature, But the thing that makes our species so different from other species, the reason why, we're sitting in buildings now using computers to talk to each other, et cetera, the reason why we dominate this planet is because our species evolved a way to cooperate among members of, not just our kin, not just our direct genetic relatives, but whatever group we happen to find ourselves in, whether that be a tribe, a kingdom, a nation, etc. Even today in capitalist countries, there's massive amounts of cooperation going on inside every corporation, inside every company. What are people doing? They're cooperating. So the idea that we're fundamentally competitive and that's how it is in nature. Well, yeah, that is true, but it's such a deep lie, because what it does is it focuses on one thing that's true, but it excludes another extremely important true fact. And by excluding this other incredibly important true fact, the one sliver of truth that they focus on becomes the blackest of lies.
Yeah, very good point there. And I guess we can just very confidently say that both aspects are human nature, that is competition and collaboration. And I always say this is so important, why we need to contextualize everything, also in sciences, is that depending on the context, one may overrule the other one more. But for example, when we have a very safe post-Second World War world in Europe, in the West, individualism and competition is very safe, because you have the means to be individualized and competitive. Let's say, for example, women's rights, social welfare. So it's not dangerous to be an individualized woman compared to the old days, where a woman needed protection, and you get a very individualist culture with very independent people, also independent women, for example. Which was relatively new in 20th century Europe. The interesting thing is the moment the world is not as safe and is more threatening, let's say a tribal country like Afghanistan, you think it's also okay to be a single individualist feminist in Afghanistan, where it's very dangerous for women and children in certain areas to just walk around? No. So what you get there is least women rights, okay, who are protected by staying in home. The man goes outside because the man is allowed to confront danger and death. So you get a very different culture. And to extrapolate it to, again, COVID-19, when you have a very threatening world, what do you need? Not individualism and competition, but collaboration and communalism, like you see in China, like you see in Hong Kong, but also other societies, Taiwan. You know what I mean? And Africa. In Africa, they're dealing with COVID-19 in many countries very well, you know? So again, depending on the kind of context we are in, we can completely create, you could almost say, different human beings. You can create very competitive individual human beings. That's why you see rich kids often being like that. They come from a very safe environment. And you can create collaborative, more communal human beings, which you often see in poorer neighborhoods, poorer areas, supporting little 12-year-old girls, supporting the family, raising the kids, handing more money to charity, poor people. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. Like when you're facing death, in a war, all of a sudden you get faith and you believe in God. Well, likewise, there are no individualist competitors in foxholes. In army,
Right.
in wartime, everything is cooperation. That's the entire social ethos. So just like that, when a war starts, all of a sudden everyone shifts into cooperation mode. So these shifts can happen very, very suddenly, and it is, like you're saying, very much tied to the context.
Right. And just to get back a bit to this point, over like we it's okay to have all these superficial anti-racist things, like, oh, you cannot say this, you cannot say that, but these politicians never go further to really close the structural gap between the wealth gap and equality with regards to race and ethnicity. And that is, of course, also that they say in this article, is when the moment you actually try in the UK to get systematic changes into racial inequality, we have this human rights report. This is from here, April 2021. Rights experts condemn UK racism report attempting to normalize white supremacy. So in other words, in their report, so they do a report into racism in the UK, and their conclusion is, or actually the report gives people the feeling that minorities are to blame, and actually it's because white people just inherently do things better, so it actually normalizes white supremacy, and it also tries to reject structural changes such as educational, to learn about colonial times, to learn about how race was structured so people understand it when they grow up, instead of thinking it's a normal thing, because race is not a normal thing. It's just been invented 500 years ago. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Before that, tens of thousands of years, we never even spoke of it. And so you see the moment, we need structural changes. And the UK does a big racism report. Nothing comes out of it. Nothing. And they try to even forbid it. Like, for example, talking about critical race theory. They try to forbid it in the UK, also in the United States, because that is structural. That is structural.
Yeah. And solving it would require structural changes, and people who are currently benefiting and very well off as a result of the current structure, understandably do not want it to change.
Exactly. So that brings me to the final market-driven rot, spiritual rot of our Western societies that I wanted to talk about, and that was the statement of Black Lives Matter with regards to the U.S. reaction to the Cuba protests. Okay, there are now protests in Cuba of a handful of people waving American flags and saying that they want America to invade Cuba against their socialist government. And then you have this statement from Black Lives Matter, who say the people of Cuba are being punished by the US government because the country has maintained its commitment to sovereignty and self-determination. United States leaders have tried to crush this revolution for decades. Instead of international amity, respect, and goodwill, the US government has only instigated suffering for the country's 11 million people, of which 4 million are black and brown. Cuba has historically demonstrated solidarity with oppressed peoples of African descent, from protecting black revolutionaries like Assata Shakur, through granting her asylum, to supporting black liberation struggles in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and South Africa. And let's not forget support for Palestinian plight. Black Lives Matter condemns the US federal government's inhumane treatment of Cuba, or Cubans, and urges it to immediately lift the economic embargo. This cruel and inhumane policy, instituted with the explicit intention of destabilizing the country and undermining Cubans' right to choose their own government, is at the heart of Cuba's current crisis. Since 1962, the United States has forced pain and suffering onto the people of Cuba by cutting off food, medicine, and supplies, costing the tiny island nation an estimated 130 billion. Without that money, it is harder for Cuba to acquire medical equipment needed to develop its own COVID-19 vaccines and equipment for food production. This comes in spite of the country's strong medical care and history of lending doctors and nurses to disasters around the world.
Yeah.
Now we look to President Biden to end the embargo, something Barack Obama called for in 2016. This embargo is a blatant human rights violation, and it must come to an end. I think this is a very, very important statement. Why? Because most of the world, and I include Asia, does not realize the genocidal embargoes, sanctions the United States puts onto poor countries who otherwise would probably have very successful socialist governments caring for its people, because here we have the market-driven brain again, because it's threatening to the free so-called market economy. because socialism puts people in front of profits. And the moment these societies become successful, this is a threat to the capitalist class.
Yeah.
So what does the US do whenever there's a successful socialist government in any country, whether it's Latin America or the Middle East, let's say Libya, the United States will stranglehold them through economic sanctions, sometimes to coup, overthrowing governments, sometimes through death squads, supporting death squads from fundamentalist Islamists to death squads in Guatemala, Latin America, and so forth, and always supporting neo-colonial right-wing governments in these Latin American societies, for example, that are pretty much always Euro elites, white Euro elites.
And that was precisely the genocide in Guatemala, the light-skinned Spanish descendant economic elite mass murdering people of indigenous descent outside of the cities because they were viewed as an economic and political threat. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right to focus on sanctions, because people normally, I think of them as like a preferable non-violent alternative to military force. But really what they are, it's the modern equivalent of siege warfare. If you had a medieval siege, you wouldn't have people directly killing people. You just starve people out by surrounding the town. Well, that's essentially what's going on. And another thing I think a lot of people don't understand about U.S. sanctions are, they think, oh, well, that just means that the U.S. isn't going to sell anything to that country. Well, that's part of it, but that's not the main part. The main part is anyone in any company around the world that uses any part that was produced by a U.S. company, they then can be sanctioned by the U.S. So if you're a Hong Kong company.
You mean Cuban company?
No. Any company anywhere in the world.
No, but I said you talked about manufactured, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
You mean anything that is related to a Cuban company, right?
No. So if they're selling to Cuba, so if you're a company here in Hong Kong, for instance,
right,
and you're a distributor of medical equipment, it might be a piece of medical equipment that is produced in Switzerland, let's say, but that company uses one component, let's say just a piece of software that it licenses from Microsoft. And then the company here in Hong Kong thinks, well, this is a Swiss product. It's not covered by the sanctions. We can sell this to Cuba. Not so fast, because then the US government will impose sanctions on your company, fine your company. And if you want to do any business in the US, or if you have any property in the US, that can just be taken over to pay the penalties for you breaking the US sanctions.
Yeah.
So they're much more encompassing than most people realize, I think. So they're like, oh, why the Cuban government is always complaining about the sanctions. They blame everything on the sanctions. Like how devastating could they possibly be if they're just cutting off Cuba from exports from the US? But no, they're not. They're cutting off exports from all over the world, so long as there is the slightest input from a US company in that product.
Right. And the danger with this whole sanction talk is always how the world gets usually very much propagandized by Western media, who say that the sanctions, are sanctions on the government to make sure that the government stops being authoritarian. While, to be very honest, these sanctions are purely, like you said, to starve the people to such an extent that the people will revolt against their own government. So hopefully, in America's eyes, the socialist government that wants to nationalize, for example, companies to feed its own people, will be overthrown. You know what I mean? So these sanctions this is just, you could say, genocidal. Same happened to Iran, and still happening to Iran, by the way, and many, many other countries, is that it's just pure punishing people, innocent people who cannot get medicines, who cannot get food, because there is a government that wants to help these people, but America doesn't like it because it's a threat to the capitalist class. This is So important for people to understand who are still thinking in mainstream terms of sanctions targeting so-called authoritarian governments. I'm going to give you an example, then I'll let you speak, Peter, and that is the following. Let me show it to you. So what I did was I did a quick search on internet on, let me check this out. And that is this. So can you see this?
Yep.
Okay, so what you see here are the search results of BLM statement Cuba, and it's not even on Google because Google is a big propaganda machine. I'm just not even trying. And this is related to how the world sees these US sanctions on these countries. And if you do BLM statement Cuba, the first thing you get is radical Marxists. BLM shows its true colors in stating, praising Cuba. Black Lives Matter faces backlash for Cuba statement. So much wrong. BLM shows its true colors in statement and praising. This is pure Western imperialist propaganda. And the whole world reads these headlines. And it took me many years to actually awaken out of this nonsense, because Black Lives Matter is actually taking a stand for the people against imperialist intervention of the United States in these countries with sanctions or with coups or with military domination. And yeah, what do you think when you see this?
Well, I mean, I think what it shows the true colors of is it shows the true colors of the kind of political establishment in the US, because when BLM is only talking about, we need racism is a problem, police maybe need to be reformed, marching in the streets about those limited issues, then you'll have all sorts of support. Corporations will put a BLM hashtag on their Twitter bio or whatever the hell it is. But then they start talking about imperialism, and all of a sudden, all that support dries up, and now BLM is this radical, horrible organization that gets this terribly wrong, and we can't support them because they're not, respecting the rights of the Cubans that we listen to in Miami. Yeah, it does show some true colors, and I think it actually shows the true colors of BLM in a very good way.
Yeah, and there we have that spiritual rot again, huh?
Yeah.
So that is that we're talking about what we were talking about before. If you are just if you're talking about superficial issues with racism as Black Lives Matter, it's fine. The moment you go structural, like for example, poor countries trying to, with socialist policies, trying to get their own poor people into a normal middle class life, at least, then US imperialism, the capitalist class, will strangle that country and squeeze their air out of their throat until they will embrace the free market, the capitalist free market. And
there's even a very telling phrase. I forget who it was that said it. It might have been Nixon, somebody in the CIA, back during the Cold War, where they were talking about, it might have been Cuba, it might have been Chile, but they referred to it as the threat of a good example. So it's just like you were saying before. If you allow, from an imperial perspective, if you allow some people to change their political economic system, and that actually improves life for the people of that country, then your arrangements in other countries are threatened, because now people in those other countries might demand similar political economic systems so that they have healthcare,
yes,
education, housing, a stable job, etc. So that was viewed explicitly, like this was a quote from someone in the US government at the time, that it's a threat of a good example.
yes, right. And it's the same with the Soviet Union. Eh? The Soviet Union also did a lot of things very well, for its working class people. Soviet Union also was pretty much the victor in the Second World War. But by really demonizing socialism, communism, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it was implemented correctly, you know what I mean? But the positive sides of socialism and communism are always, well, we're not even discussing it because our propaganda machine makes it so sound so evil and so bad that people don't even want to discuss it anymore. And communist or Marxist has become a how can you say that, a swear word. And when you actually ask most people, 90% I would say of the people, please tell me, what is Marxism, what is communism, they will just either don't know or just come up with a very mainstream ridiculous view that they have been indoctrinated with. And I think this case of Cuba and BLM, expression of BLM, is a very, again, a pivotal moment in our decaying society, just like with Dr. Cornel West, because it's the clash. It's a clash between the old mind that demonized anti-imperialism, that demonized socialism and Marxism, that demonize people who stand up for the Palestinians, for colonized people, with the new mind, the new world, the new generation that is pro-Palestinian rights, that is pro-anti-imperialism, okay, that is more socialist, more Marxist, and anti-capitalist and anti-market-driven societies. And I think this is just a very interesting example of this, and how you see that the media is still indoctrinating the world with that pro-imperialist American nonsense. And you see that divide between the new and the old generation in somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who on the one hand wants to be part of that new generation, that anti-imperialist generation, with one foot, with the other foot in the old mind, that is the Democratic Party that has always been pro-imperialist, anti-communist, pro-capitalist, free market-driven society. And she is trying to balance that game, and it isn't working.
Yeah.
It isn't working. She is supporting the pro-imperialist forces in the protests or in Cuba, which are white European elites most of the time. And at the same time, her younger fans are saying, what are you doing?
Yeah. You do have like some still this kind of like fuzzy-headed thinking among people of her kind of milieu, like the activists around her, the kind of activist community in like a New York or in LA or wherever in the US. This particular kind of fuzzy-headed thinking about other countries where you basically just judge them according to your basic kind of moral principles for how a country should act. So you tell them, you know what, in Cuba, if you're a Cuban, you do not have the freedom to just go travel to whatever country you want. You have to get a permit from the government that will allow you to travel to another country. And they would say, well, that's a horrible thing. Like, that's not what I want. I don't want to live in a society where I have to, ask the government for permission to leave. So, my evaluation of the Cuban government is now kind of mixed. Like, they did some good things on healthcare, equality, etc. But then on this thing, they're bad, and so we need to criticize them for it. And I call this fuzzy-headed thinking because once you think of it in international relations terms, you think of this as the world as this complex system of geopolitics. What is the Cuban government's better option? So that's where I always have trouble. I call it fuzzy-headed because I never hear people say, "Oh, this is what they should do," because this is what would happen if you actually think through it. So yes, I also want all countries in the world to allow their people to travel freely. Of course, I want that too. But if the Cuban government did that immediately, what would be the result? The immediate result would be Cuba spends more of its kind of social resources, its kind of economic surplus, on educating doctors and training doctors than basically any country on earth. I looked this up. Per capita, Cuba is like number 3 in the world for number of doctors, and the other two are Qatar, plenty of oil money, and I forget the third one. It's like Luxembourg or something. So they put all of these social resources into training doctors. Now, what happens when you on this poor island nation, you say, yeah, people, you can freely travel wherever the heck you want to go. Well, the US government is going to roll out a red carpet for Cuban doctors to leave Cuba and then go work in the US, where they can all of a sudden, they got this education, they now have medical knowledge. They can go to the US and start making $200,000, $300,000 a year. All of a sudden you become rich. So that's the context that Cuba's in. So now you tell me, the activist I'm imagining in my head here, you tell me what they should do given that context. Do you say, yes, the principle of free travel overrides everything else? Then okay, then Cuba can no longer afford to spend so much of its social resources on educating doctors. Now you're saying basically that you think that the freedom to travel is more important than the ability of society to have a society like Cuba, a poor country, their ability to have good healthcare and their ability to train so many doctors that they then send all over the world to poor countries to provide healthcare. So
And
that's yeah.
sorry, go ahead. Sorry,
I
I
mean,
thought.
that's the kind of fuzzy-headed thinking you see in activist left circles. I think all over the West, certainly, maybe all over the world as well. I'm not as tapped in, but yeah, it's very frustrating, and I think AOC is very much a product of that kind of environment.
Right, and that brings us again to the what we discussed before as well, is that you must take the context into account. Like all these individual freedoms and individualism works if you live in a rich, high wealth society where people can just do what they want on their own. Like, for example, being an independent woman. Then when you go to a high threat society with not a lot of resources, like for example, Afghanistan, where women's rights, of course, immediately suffer because that's the only way for protection. So you get a more authoritarian kind of unfree society for the safety of its people, for survival. This is pure survival. And it's like projecting the Western mindset onto another group of people in a different context. So and it's the same with Cuba. If you stranglehold Cuban society as the United States, killing thousands of people because you have sanctions that the whole world cannot deal with Cuba, of course you get a society that needs strict rules to survive. You cannot say, oh, let's do everything free, man. Like you said as well, go where you want, do what you want, say what you want. How do you want to coordinate a society like that if you don't have that wealth and that say social safety net to do these things? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And it's
And then,
just
yeah, and then people say like, "Oh, you're justifying evil policies," and it's like, no, it's not about justifying anything. I'm not trying to make a moral case here one way or the other. I'm just saying I'm pointing out the geopolitical context and then inviting you to proffer a better alternative policy. But once
But
you
it's the
put
same
into
as justifying that. It's the same as justifying in the West that poverty is your own responsibility. It's the flip side. You say, okay, you cannot have freedom in a society like Cuba. Oh, you're justifying that kind of society. But you're saying, oh, but in your society, poverty is your own mistake because that's your personal responsibility. So you're justifying poverty. So which one do you want? You know
yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah, it's really frustrating. Also, that ties into, you mentioned that people, if you ask the average person, they really don't know what communism is or socialism is, etc. Well, the original theory was that the advanced countries, the countries that had gone through capitalist development first, who had, raped and pillaged the rest of the world to develop their own industry, those were the societies that were supposed to have the revolution that brought in a socialist system. And then from countries like Germany, from the UK, from the US, once they had a socialist revolution, then the idea was, well, then under a socialist society, they would just share their technology with the whole world. Like they would send experts over to Libya, Angola, et cetera. Here, we're going to build a factory. We're going to train your people so you can run it. We're going to, share our technological expertise, et cetera. That didn't happen. So what was the country that did have a revolution? It was the poorest country in Europe at the time, or one of the poorest, most feudal societies, most backward societies that didn't have the kind of industrialization that Western European countries did. So then you're put into that position. All of a sudden, as soon as you have your revolution, you have all of the most powerful countries in the world at the time sending troops in to try to overthrow the revolution and put back the kind of old oligarchic system that existed before. And so a lot of the kind of the evolution and development of Soviet socialism was in that context of being under this immense outward threat directed at you. Plus, you don't have that century of capitalist development and exploitation that built up your industry already. You need to build it from scratch. So all of these things that we look at the USSR and say, I don't like the fact that people didn't have the freedom to move to wherever they wanted to do whatever job they wanted to. I don't like that either. But then what is your alternative? Would you say that, oh, okay, the USSR never should have been in existence in the first place? They should have followed capitalist development that entire time. Okay, fine. But then as a result of that you're going to have baked into that cake a certain amount of poverty, suffering. That is just part and parcel of capitalist development that we can just, look at history. That's how it happens. So you're either saying you want that, or you want this kind of ideal situation, this ideal government without reference at all to the geopolitical environment that that country was positioned in at the time. So this kind of thinking is very frustrating.
It's still also a weird focus. I mean, if you focus on, oh, you are not very free there, but why do you focus on that instead of your society, your country, just taking all the breath out of that society by sanctions and other means of how can I say that? Well, imperialism, so to speak. So that is so strange to me. Like, why is your focus on so-called authoritarian socialist governments in societies that your society, your country is not allowing to develop? You know what I mean? It's just ridiculous that somebody like AOC is doing that. For me, that's just baffling,
Sadly, it's not baffling to me because I grew up and interacted with a lot of people who think like that, and it's understandable. It's like, yeah, if you want to support people that want to change their government, you want to support self-determination. So you just see a protest somewhere, and your initial reaction is, oh, I want to support that. That's good. People should protest when they want to change things. But then it's that fuzzy-headed thinking of not keeping in mind the geopolitical context, not knowing the history in a lot of cases. A lot of people don't really know the history of imperialism, of colonialism.
But also who are behind these protests? I mean, why don't you first do your study and check who are behind these protests? In fact, pro-government protests in Cuba are larger than anti-government protests, and the anti-government protests. Why don't you ask yourself, who are these anti-government protesters waving American flags, wanting capitalism? Who are they? They are almost always not the indigenous people, not the black and brown people. They're almost always descendants of the Euro elites who want their capitalist oppression back. They want their neo-colonial capitalist oppression back. And you see it all over Latin America. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's still that dynamic, that really ugly dynamic is still very much at play in Colombia right now.
Right, Chile.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think Colombia is just the saddest example I can think of, because it's just been a 150-year long period of, I mean, actually it could go further back because there was plenty of violence before then. Just it was normalized violence. You're working on my plantation, I can do whatever the hell I want to. But any sort of movement to try to take power away from that elite and share it more broadly so that everyone can have a decent life, that gets fought so violently, so viciously. I mean, just reading about the kinds of violence in Colombia, but so many other countries, the pattern is the same. The traditional elite protects their privilege so jealously, so violently, so viciously.
I know.
Terribly sad.
And I think the world needs to know that the biggest supporter of this tremendous terror and violence towards poor and indigenous people is the United States and Europe. And you see it, how far they go when it comes to the death squads. You saw in Guatemala, what you say about Bolivia, the rape and murder on a systematic level that is supported by the United States and also many European and other North American governments, such as Canada.
Yeah, in the Guatemala case, there was weapons shipped from Taiwan there because there was a little bit of a tension in the U.S. in the 80s about the kind of violent depredation going on through the church because there were priests and nuns being raped and murdered, and so
Yeah,
you would have some religious-based organizations spreading information about what was really going on. And that was able to at least get enough support in Congress to kind of cut off some funding. The whole Iran-Contra affair was based on trying to get around what Congress had done. But you had countries like Taiwan shipping weapons over there. You have this kind of these Israel would do that, South Africa would
satellite
do
states.
that.
Yeah.
There whenever the US population would learn a little bit about the evil things their government was doing and then pressured their representatives to put an end to that, well then you get the allies to go and do it for you.
And we saw the same, right? We saw the same with the rendition program, and
Oh
they had
yeah.
the illegal prisons of the United States. Oh wait, we are not allowed to torture people. Then the United States just creates torture prisons in other parts of the world, in the satellite states, and start torturing
Yeah.
people there. I
Send them
mean,
to
even
Egypt, send them to Syria. People
yeah,
from
yeah, yeah, but also in
Syria.
Europe,
Yeah.
also in Europe, in European prisons, and um, the same is happening in the Middle East. I mean, people still think in these simple terms about around Muslim extremism and the West and democracy and blah blah blah. Well, the same is happening in the Middle East and in countries like Syria, where the US is also supporting, just like in Latin America, these terrible death squads and murdering, raping groups of people just to protect capitalist interests. There's a total lack of human empathy and morality among these capitalists. You know what I mean?
Well, you're taught to do that in your first like IR class, like the basic one of the first lessons you'll get is that there's this split between idealists and realists, and the realists are saying morality just has no role to play whatsoever in international relations. It's a category error to try to apply morality. You need to focus only on power maximization. So I think that's a really powerful tool to get people to allow them to do these kinds of, to implement these kinds of policies, like funneling money to jihadi groups, funding money to death squads in Latin America. Normally you would think people's moral reaction would be they would find that abhorrent. But if you have the right ideology to say to allow you to do evil because you think it's for a greater good, then that's a powerful way of allowing people to commit atrocities.
But that is, in fact, this ideological dichotomy between letting yourself be driven by morality or not is simply an ideological dichotomy between the powerful and the non-powerful. It's almost like capitalism versus socialism. The powerful will say the world is non-moral. We should just do what we want. That's an elitist way of seeing the world. That's why you see that a lot in Western sciences. And the moral view would be you have to protect the people and indigenous groups, and you have to get the poor out of poverty. And those with the ideology that are in favor of a non-morality fight that ideology. It's pure. Every professor that teaches that stuff, the world is anarchic. There is no morality. It's just eat or get eaten. That is an elitist view of people who are on top of the power.
Yeah, it
Very
is
simple.
suspiciously self-serving, especially
Self-justifying. I was just going to say it.
yeah.
Pure self-justifying nonsense. Just like individualism in the free market. If you are the most powerful group, you have the most money, then of course you would say free market individualism works best because it's good for you.
Yeah.
Especially when you monopolized, racially, economically, anything. But when you say, no, we are moral beings, we should think about the welfare of the marginalized and other people, then you would say, no, the world doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
And then you get one of Hirschman's three rhetorics of reaction. So it's what is it? It's futility, Oh yeah, that's a really nice idea, but it's just not going to work. You know, it's just it's too complicated. You can't provide education for all. It's going to waste money and it's not going to work. Jeopardy. Oh, you risk all of these wonderful social gains that we've had in the past if we do this other policy. It's going to risk some kind of perverse effect. So we just can't possibly do that. And then perversity is very related to that. It's like, yeah, you think that by offering a kind of creating a social safety net that you'll be helping people, but actually what's going to happen is it's going to make people lazy and they're going to be even more poor. So one
Right.
of these rhetorics is always rolled out to argue against anything. And here in IR, it would be the perversity thesis, because what they're saying is if a country tries to implement morality in their foreign policy, that is going to take away from the focus on power maximization, meaning their power is going to be lowered. And by lowering their power, that's going to put them at risk of extermination. So you can't risk extermination. That's you're going to have this perverse effect. You might think you're being nice and good by trying to impose some moral, strictures on your foreign policy. Oh, but it'll have this horrible perverse effect.
Yeah, well, and in the meantime, we are actually heading towards total human climate annihilation,
Right. Yeah.
because we are still living in that capitalist Western view of profit maximization and market-driven world. And okay, that's a whole nother discussion, but
Yeah. That's the
for
irony
example,
there. That's the
I was
perfect.
thinking about how the military industrial complex that's profit driven is also the biggest polluter in the world. Yet we don't hear our Swedish angel, what's her name, the the
Greta
climate.
Thunberg.
We don't hear Greta Thunberg talk about anti-imperialism.
I, I
That is something that is always lacking among the Western, and I'd say majority white, not all, left activists, is anti-imperialism and anti-racism. Without both, we are not going to solve climate change and collaborate across the world. We are not. And then this Greta Thunberg she's young. I mean, I cannot
yeah,
blame her too much.
exactly.
But that you say that about, like, for example, that she was both siding with Israel, who's completely ethnically cleansing and colonized Palestinians, to not understand that anti-imperialism should be central in climate action is just baffling. But this is another discussion, I guess, for
Yeah.
another time.
The way I understand it is just like, young person who gets really engaged in this really important existential issue, and then just thinks, you know what, I don't want to get into the politics. I want to just focus on the science, and then kind of somebody else will figure out the politics. I just
Yeah, a
want
lot of powerful people like you to do that. Don't
exactly.
focus on the politics, just the
Exactly.
superficial stuff, not the structural stuff, remember?
Right. So Obama can meet with Thunberg and like have a nice photo op. Like I'm a good, caring,
Yes.
intelligent guy that cares about science. So I'm gonna meet this young climate activist who's a source of hope in the world. But when I actually had power, what the hell was I doing with it? I was not really pushing for anything like what's required, not even fighting for it. Like, granted, there are massive structural obstacles to getting anything like what's required in the U.S. political system, but these people didn't even fight for it. So
And I mean, if she wants to have some kind of influence, why don't I hear the climate activists about the whole case with Stephen Danziger, and the pollution, and he won the case against one of the biggest polluters in where was it, in Brazil,
no, in Ecuador.
Ecuador, yeah,
Yeah,
in where he won the case against the big polluter with the indigenous people there.
yeah,
Why don't I hear these Western climate activists, seeing them strongly supporting indigenous struggles of people who are really, really fighting the serious daily effects on their lives of climate change due to our polluting corporations? But again, I guess this is a very interesting talk for another time.
yeah. No, that's a whole other discussion that we should do.
But related again to the whole
Yeah,
Western isolated mindset. Yeah.
yeah. And I'm not a religious person anymore, as you know, but I do find Cornel West's framing of the problem appropriate. That it's a moral rot. It's a I think he
Yeah,
uses spiritual rot or moral
yeah,
decay.
spiritual rot, moral decay, whatever.
Yeah.
But hey,
It even reminds me of something Benjamin Franklin said when he saw the first draft of the Constitution. He said something like, I think this will work well for a few years in creating a republic, but it'll eventually evolve into oligarchy due to the corruption of the people. And so that, when Cornel West talks about, when he frames it in terms of moral decay or spiritual rot, I think that there definitely is something there. I think it's a worthwhile framing to consider.
right. And Chris Hedges says the same all the time, like the moral decay of our societies. And one of the crucial aspects of that is, in fact, our spiritual, he says, our spiritual disconnect from nature. The idea that we are independent and disconnected from nature, instead of that old spiritual connection like Native Americans had with nature, which makes you see it as part of your own life and respect it, you know? When we had Christianity coming up, even in the Bible, you can read about how humanity should dominate the nature and the seas. It's really deeply ingrained into our cultures, you know. But yeah, so I guess that's a bit of pessimistic but good note to end on of our today's show about the spiritual rot of our
Yeah,
Western societies.
indeed, indeed.
So yeah, good talk and well, next time we're gonna talk to a famous sociologist on this channel,
Next
Wertheim.
Friday?
Yeah, she will just talk with us about how she as a Jewish Dutch person, grew up in colonial Indonesia, and also she experienced the occupation of the Japanese. So she was in the Japanese internment camp. And later on, she spent her life focusing on the sociology of colonial racism, how that is still part of our lives, but also during colonial Indonesia. So very interesting lady, also daughter of one of Europe's very famous sociologists who also did a lot of work on colonial racism and white supremacy. So I'm looking forward to
Yeah, me
that
too.
talk.
Me too.
Okay, well, great talk, and thanks for your input today, Peter.
Yeah, yeah, good talking with you too.
And up to the next show.